Chapter 10. The Doctors. In early January 1979, I began seeing psycho doctors, first on court orders, then at the insistence of my attorney to strengthen his insanity defense. One thing is certain. If you think you know yourself, if you think you understand the meaning of what you're doing in everyday life, if you feel that all your hatches are sealed tight and your sails are well adjusted, you still will not leave the shrink's office without being labeled as something that meant nothing to you before, but a long Greek word that you'd sidestep in your reading. I told Amirani, long before seeing the first doctor, that I was against the insanity defense. Really, how could he convince 12 people that I was insane 33 times, then suddenly 33 times transposed back to sanity, showered and shaved, suited and sane, returned to running a business and working as hard as I did without showing any signs of aberration or of imbalance? But more about that later. My first meeting with Doctors of Enlightenment was a joke. I was taken down to a first-floor office of Cermak Hospital by Superintendent Patrick. All he told me was that there were 2 doctors from the court with an order to interview me. But Amirani had failed to tell me what was expected of me. He had told me to be cooperative with the doctors who interviewed me. But he also had told me not to talk to anyone or give out any information unless he was present, or unless they could properly identify themselves. So when I went with no instructions from him, not knowing what I was or wasn't supposed to tell them, not knowing where, legally or practically, the borders of confidentiality were located. When I got a look at the 2 strangers, I thought I had walked into the wrong room. They looked like a couple of escapees from the old folks' home I sometimes visited as Pogo the Clown. These 2 doctors stood in the center of the room, rickety, looking for a place to hang their coats and hats. Both wore glasses and those squeaky black rubbers over their shoes. I wanted to help them into a chair and get blankets to spread over their legs so they wouldn't be cold. The first one told me his name was Dr. Hartman, a psychologist from next door, sent over by the court. He introduced me to his friend, Dr. Reifman, then flinched back as if I were about to bite him. I wasn't sure if I should extend my hand in a friendly gesture for fear it would cause him a heart attack. He pulled some papers from his pocket and said that he was from the Cook County Psychiatric Institute and had an order from the court to determine whether I was fit to stand trial. Then he stepped back behind Hartman. Remembering Sam's instructions, I asked, "Do you have anything to show me that will prove who you are and that you're here from the court?" Reifman pulled out a business card and handed it to me. I told him a business card wasn't actually good for identification. He brought out the court order to show me that both their names were on it. That still didn't identify them, and I wouldn't buy it. Amirani's orders were to be sure about who I was talking to before saying a word, and that's what I was doing, attempting to verify their identity. Reifman showed me what he said was Garippo's signature, but I didn't know Garippo's signature. Anyone could have signed it. I had become very cagey. I didn't believe much of anything by then. The state had played so many games with lies, tricks, and innuendo. Why not with a couple of actors? I was not being belligerent or rancorous. I wasn't going to march into any kind of trap. I just wasn't going to march into any kind of trap. I told them about my attorney's warning. They were puzzled. They didn't know what to do. Finally, Reifman said, "Look, I'll call Judge Garippo on the phone and he can tell you who we are." He walked to the phone, dialed, talked with someone, then handed me the phone, saying it was Garippo. The voice on the phone said he was Judge Garippo, that he had signed the order, and that the two men were who they said they were. I said okay and hung up. But I told them I still had a problem. How did I know that it was Garippo on the phone? They gave up. It's all right. We found out what we wanted to know, that you can work with your counsel. A few days later, Emma Ranney asked me how things went. I told him how it went and what they said at the end, and I didn't know what they meant by that. Well, you'll be seeing them again. They have to give you some tests. Will you let me know when someone's coming? Or better yet, be here for the first meeting? That was all right with him, so I felt like I was off the hook. I was to meet with this Dr. Reifman 4 times for a total of 18 hours, although he claimed in court that he spent 25 hours with me. 2 of those times he brought Hartman with him. When I tried to cooperate with them, most of the time I had trouble understanding them, answering their questions with questions, trying to figure out what it was they wanted. Most of the time Hartman seemed confused or on the brink of dozing off. He gave me mostly written tests, some technical, using a stopwatch to time my progress. Dr. Reifman, when alone with me, was manifestly terrified. The first time he came to my room, he placed his chair close to the door, and when the guard moved to close it for our privacy, the good doctor jumped so high I thought he might not come down. No, don't close the door. It'll lock. The officer explained about the noise in the hall and said he'd be right outside. That wasn't good enough. The doctor didn't want to be locked in the room with me. The guard left the door ajar. He asked me basic questions like, had I ever felt that I was someone else, and what kind of moods did I have? I told him that I was only one person, but I lived in different moods depending on what I was doing. John the contractor was all business. John the politician was involved in community activity and helping others. When I had free time, I was Pogo the clown because I loved children and remembered what it was like to be alone and frightened in the hospital when I was a child. In the night, when I was out looking for prostitutes, male or female, I didn't like what I was doing, so I would call myself Jack. And there was also just plain John, the family man who liked to putter around the house and fix things, do horticulture, play with the dog, or cook. Reifman came out later in the newspapers to say that I claimed 4 different personalities, but that isn't what I said. He had been talking about different moods, not radical personality separation, or the profound aberrations he referred to in court. He broached publicly the subject of multiple personalities. I think it's normal to feel differently about different things. Everyone will modify their mood to harmonize with what they are doing. Is that to say they are crazy or need to see a shrink? Going fishing or to a ball game creates a mood. Dancing, gourmet dining, sex, a funny movie. Each has its own mood. No. I had to believe these men of enlightenment were closer to the cracker factory than I was. But all that talk about minds was beginning to spook me. Emma Ranney came by one day to tell me he was able to get Dr. Richard G. Rapaport to see me. You would have thought it was the greatest day in my life. He was bubbling. I had never heard of the man. My first impression of Rapaport was of a gigolo on a perpetual hustle, a gaudy ladies' man, out of the daily soaps. He wore a sport coat, open-neck shirt, and sunglasses. But over a period of time, I became very relaxed with him. The atmosphere became that of two guys talking over old times. His style was to let you ask questions rather than just to have you blindly make responses as the first two doctors had done. With him being so casual, I came to have a feeling of security and trust. We covered every subject under the sun, not always related to the charges against me, but more how I felt about different things. He wasn't afraid to be alone with me in the room. I wanted it quiet while we talked 2 and 3 hours at a time. He started seeing me the middle of April 1979 and continued through June, 2 and sometimes 3 times a week. He spent over 65 hours with me during that time, more than all the doctors the prosecution sent combined. You would never believe me after hearing the claims of time and expense the state said they had spent in their evaluations. Since Rapaport was a psychiatrist, he wanted me to see a psychologist who worked with him, Dr. Robert Traisman, in order to get a complete psychological examination. Dr. Hartman had given me some tests, but Dr. Traisman had many more for me, both written and motor aptitude tests. He saw me only twice, but each session was lengthy. Dr. Rapaport didn't say much to me about what he was extracting from our conversations, and nothing at all about his extrapolations or his impressions. He was thoroughgoing. He had me see a neurologist, Dr. John Garvin, a Dr. John Hughes, who gave me an EEG, and a Dr. Glenn D. Dobbin for a computer head scan. All of these men are respected specialists in their fields. But I thought the most important test he arranged for was a 4-hour sodium amytal truth serum interview. This was done by Dr. Barry Shapiro, chief of the Department of Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation at Northwestern University Medical School and Hospital. He had been the private heart specialist for the late Mayor Richard J. Daley. Before the test, because of my heart condition, I had to sign a statement granting permission and a release in case of my death. A full gram of the truth serum was administered me in that 4-hour period, the maximum a person can handle without jeopardy. It produced a clinically adequate semi-hypnotic state, during which I described things in greater detail. But there was no new information revealed about the crimes. The test indicated that what I told them in the conscious state was true, and that even in the semi-hypnotic state, I could not enlighten them further. This test was not mentioned during my trial because it would have contradicted Amirani's insanity defense. Any time evidence came out favorable to me, it was blocked, either by the state or by my own defense team. Dr. Rapaport included that in his 19-page offering to the court, but it was buried. He stated that, in his opinion, a mental disease was indicated, labeling it borderline character, psychopathic subtype, and paranoid schizophrenic. He went on to say, if Mr. Gacy did commit the crimes of which he is accused, then these periods for which he is amnesiac are the times of loss of control and the times of the murderous acts. His inability to tell about these facts is a loss in some respects to this case. If John Gacy did in fact commit the murders of which he is accused, it is my impression that he was responding to an irresistible impulse which was allowed expression by the loss of ego controls under the influence of alcohol, drugs, extreme fatigue, and the stress of psychological conflicts within him. It is therefore my opinion that John Gacy was, under the law of Illinois, insane at the time of the alleged crime when he was unable to conform his conduct to the requirement of the law. If I had committed the crimes, and if I had been found guilty by a jury after hearing some evidence, this doctor's statement would have been the basis for an insanity plea. On July 12, 1979, I met Dr. Tobias Brocher, director of the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas, a center for applied behavioral sciences. At Emirani's request, he came from West Germany, where he was doing research for the foundation. The man is world-renowned in the field of psychiatry. At the trial, it took more than 20 minutes just to list his credentials. He visited me only once, but he spent more than 5 hours with me on that occasion. To me, he was one of just 2 true professionals to be heard at the trial, at least in the sense of integrity, not because what he said was favorable to us in respect to the insanity defense, but I found great respect for the man when he refused to answer questions concerning the relationship between the law and insanity. He felt he could give an opinion as to mental disease or defect, of which I claimed I had several, because his expertise in that field. But just as most people in the legal profession don't understand psychiatry, he could not give an expert opinion regarding the application of the law to insanity. The jury failed to see this point. Emirani was pleased with Brocher's report. It showed concordance with his insanity defense. But because he would not answer questions that commingled insanity and law, the state discredited his testimony. In the late fall of 1979, the state, after seeing the reports of the 3 doctors Emirani had brought in, pleaded to the court to get permission for further opinions. I had thought both sides had made their points by then. I was wrong again. Garipo granted the state's motion. I was going to have to see more doctors. In October, I met the first of 4 more doctors for the state. Dr. James Kavanaugh was just as smooth as Rapaport had been, but more arrogant. He started by asking what I had covered with the other doctors and how I felt about what was happening. I told him the same things I told the others. One thing about the truth, it will always come out the same. He was like a kid racing through a hot novel looking for the explicit parts. I dreaded having to spend as much time with him as I'd done with Dr. Rapaport, but I got lucky. During the month, he only wanted 14 loathsome hours. We barely scratched any surfaces. He didn't do a fraction of what Dr. Rapaport had done, but claimed he had gathered enough information. The scuttlebutt had him pigeonholed as a professional witness for the state. He had it down to a science as to how little time and effort he could spend and still receive his fee. I was told that his diagnoses were carbon copy standard at most of the trials he worked. A true shrink for hire. Kavanaugh was the one who wanted the alcohol EEG test set up at the Cook County Psychiatric Institute, but he didn't know how to give one. The results showed nothing judgeable. The prosecution said it had been negligently administered, emphasizing negligently as if it were favorable to the state. They went through the motions and manipulated with clever language both the public and the jury. Listen, but don't think. Emirani had an eminent psychologist accompany Dr. Rapaport to court, and the state countered by providing Kavanaugh with an entourage of associates. He had interviewed me for only 14 hours, and every doctor for the state who as much as shook my hand was in attendance as an expert. They brought in a Dr. Garen who had taken 3 hours to give me a mechanical and written test. Along with him came a Dr. Rogers, a young guy just out of college, scared yet eager to spout from his $100 books. He had given me only one test. The SADS diagnostic interview made up of 4,500 questions, from which he felt he understood what caused me to grin, and why I rested my elbow on my knee and my jaw on my fist when I shit. But only 10% of all psychologists use the SADS because its findings are considered to be unreliable. In late November, I saw the last of the state's Isaac Ray Center team. Dr. Jan Fawcett visited with me for a time, going over the same things Dr. Kavanaugh had covered. In court, he claimed that he had spent 7 hours with me. All those doctors padded their hours for 2 reasons. They were paid by the hour, and it braced their feeble findings. Amirani was sold on the insanity defense, so he had me taken to see Dr. Lawrence Friedman, another Tobias Brocher with impeccable credentials. He was a professor at Yale Law School for 15 years, Yale Medical School for 20 years, served at Cambridge, Stanford, the University of Tel Aviv, and was now chairman of the International Institution of Social and Behavioral Pathology, headquartered at the University of Chicago. I wondered how they could have enticed his services. Because of his distinction and busy schedule, he didn't come to see me. I was taken to him, 3 times a week, 2 or 3 hours at a time. The first thing he did was tell the officers to remove the handcuffs so I could relax. Talking to him was like talking to the serene grandfather that I never had, a figure who inspired trust. He was the 10th doctor I talked to, and again I had to start all over from the beginning. But he was a good listener and had very few questions, wanting me to express myself, to stroll with him through my strongest memories from my childhood up to the present. I did most of the talking while he busied himself making notes. Just like Dr. Rapaport, I spent 65 hours with him over a period of 2 months. Just like Dr. Brocher, he proved to be a man of integrity. He felt he could answer questions only in the field of his expertise, psychiatry, and refused to extend his opinion to the legal aspect. He was called to give a medical statement. The lawyers could provide the legal testimony. While I was seeing Dr. Friedman every other morning, Sam came up with another psychiatrist to see me simultaneously, Dr. Helen Morrison. She came across as a sincere person, but I felt like she liked to play games with me, to rouse me into reactions. Maybe it wasn't so much her style, but the fact that after 3 hours with Dr. Friedman in the morning, I was in no mood for another session with anyone in the afternoon. I think if you're not half cracked going into these head excavations, something unhealthy transpires. As banal and insane as it seems to me, talking those hundreds of hours about myself, those powerful memory jaunts I took, well, it just wasn't meant for any men to engage in that much introspection. It took its toll, but it continued for the next 2 months. Talk, introspection, retrospection, morning and afternoon. I asked Amirani, "What's the matter, Sam? Can't you get us no weekend bookings?" Even though I had agreed to go along with what he wanted, it was now crowding me. "It's making me goofy, Sam. It feels like these shrinks are going into my head with jackhammers and blasting caps." I asked why he didn't ask for a continuance, why we were being so pressed. He would only say that Garippa wouldn't do it. January 1980. I couldn't believe it. Amirani had another psychologist he wanted me to see, and he was going to come on Saturday and Sunday. Dr. Thomas Aliso came to the jail's hospital on January 12th and returned the following day. Since he was coming in from Rockford and had no time during the week, his only opportunity was that weekend. He began with a short interview that sent me through a series of tests, starting with the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and the Halstead-Wrighton Neurophysical Test Battery. Some of these I'd had before. This was the 4th clinical psychologist I'd seen within a year's time. With no without knowing what the results might mean to a professional, I had to become acquainted with some of the tests, like the Rorschach ink blot test, the draw a person test, the thematic apperception test, which is done blindfolded. Here I was, 37 years old, playing with blocks and funny pictures, trying to tell some grim, austere character what spilled ink defined. The final, and what came to be the most controversial test I took, was called the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. I had taken it some months before with Dr. Traceman, but having gone through it before gave me no help the second time. It's too complex. I couldn't have known a right answer from a wrong one. Example: do you like fishing? If I say no, maybe they say I'm un-American. If I say yes, maybe they decide my fetish is killing innocent fish. I answered all 526 questions in a rapid-fire succession in 2 hours and 30 minutes. That's an average of 3.5 questions and answers a minute. Spontaneity had to be the key. No time to ponder for the best answer. Yet, at the trial, Kunkel claimed I faked the test, that I knew what answers to give to avoid any negative perception. Now, how the hell could I fake answers to questions that had no right or wrong for me? I couldn't even get a cigar in jail, let alone an answer crib from a university in another state. The test can only be evaluated at the University of Minnesota, where it was originally designed. The lie factor on my test was 0, meaning that I wasn't lying on the answers. That frosted Kunkel. In its reports, with no knowledge of who had taken the test, the university wrote, "The profile is consistent with an individual who was diagnosed as schizophrenic, showing paranoid and manic elements. Thus, the individual on this more objective test shows signs of being an active, belligerent, suspicious individual in his basic personality type. Even though on the surface he appears pleasant, comfortable, and benevolent and accepting of other people. He also shows some confusion in his thinking at times, which again he does not display overtly. This probably shows itself when he is under stress. Under severe stress, he decompensates into an overt psychotic state. This all came out of the one test. Score another point for Emirani's insanity defense. All told, I had seen 12 doctors, a total of 67 hours for the state and 201 hours for the defense. During the trial, 6 doctors were called to the stand for each side. All the doctors came up with different diagnoses, but to some degree they would coincide with those of other doctors representing their side. The state would agree that there were mental problems, but to a lesser degree than what the defense would say. The state was able to contradict, one by one, all the doctors' opinions favorable to my defense. That's the reason why I was against the insanity defense. I thought my case would be fought on the evidence that the state should have to prove me guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt, of the charges against me. What I didn't know was, once the insanity defense was agreed to, the state didn't have to prove me guilty of anything. Emirani never told me that. When he decided on the insanity defense, he was automatically saying that I had committed the murders, handing the state its case. From that point forward, everything is stipulated to, and the trial becomes merely an insanity hearing. The state didn't even have to associate me with the victims before, during, or after the murders. The state didn't know the identity of 11 of the victims and would have to dismiss any charges against me relating to them. That would have been my first step if I'd had the legal expertise. Then I would have made them try me on each count individually. I was a chronic keeper of records and could account for most of my time. I could prove that I was out of town when at least 16 of the victims disappeared. The fact that those bodies were found on my property did not make me the killer. The house was rented to PDM and was its home office. For that reason, there were 12 employees with keys to the place. The office manager didn't come in until 8 in the morning and was usually done by noon. He never went in at night, and everyone knew that. While I was out of town, and I was gone up to 2 weeks at a time, anyone could have come in, and many did. During late hours, young employees, even married ones, would come there to party. Privacy, drugs, booze, and beds. What more could they ask for? And who was to know how many went in and didn't come out? But from the beginning, Sam Amirani was stuck on the insanity defense and was adamant against any other pursuit. What a damn Waterloo for me and the little heedless general.